The story opens with the ultimate subversion of office hierarchy. Danielle had spent 5 years anticipating every command from Park Tae-Sung. But today, the only thing she was delivering was a finality he never saw come. As the divorce agreement hovered between them like a blade, she unbuttoned her soft pink coat, letting the fabric fall to reveal the 8-month life growing beneath her heart, forcing the most dangerous man in Korea to drop his pen as his world fractured in an instant. Welcome to Korean Mafia Love Tales, your ultimate destination for gripping stories of the Korean Mafia, underworld power, and forbidden interracial romance. Dive into thrilling Mafia tales filled with dangerous love, betrayal, obsession, and passion set in the dark and mysterious underworld. Our stories feature powerful Korean Mafia bosses, strong female leads, and intense romantic connections that cross cultures and boundaries. If you love Mafia romance, Korean drama vibes, billionaire love stories, and underworld tales, this channel is for you. Subscribe for weekly uploads of addictive Mafia stories, Korean underworld romance, love tales, and dramatic storytelling that will keep you hooked till the end. If you want to see how this story goes, stay with me until the very end. And as we begin, hit that like button and tell me in the comments what you think about this story. The air in the penthouse was filtered to a clinical perfection, smelling of expensive leather and the faint, metallic tang of the city's skyline through the glass. Park Tae-Sung did not look up when the heavy oak doors clicked shut. He remained a statue of quiet power, his attention fixed on the document before him as if it were a standard acquisition of a rival firm. He adjusted his luxury watch, the movement precise and robotic, before finally sliding the divorce agreement across the mahogany desk with the tip of a gold fountain pen. "Everything is as you requested, Danielle," he said, his voice a low, controlled rasp that gave no hint of the 7 months of silence between them. "The Busan estate, the offshore accounts, and the non-disclosure terms. Sign it, and we can conclude this transaction." Danielle Brooks stood on the other side of the desk, a radiant figure in soft pink and white that felt like a direct insult to the sterile, dark shadows of his office. She looked at the man she had served for 5 years as a secretary and loved for 3 as a wife. He was still the false king, viewing their life together as a series of line items to be settled. "You always did have a way with numbers, Tae-Sung," she said, her voice steady and unshaken. "But you were never very good at seeing what was right in front of you." Tae-Sung leaned forward, his piercing, calculating eyes narrowing. "I see a woman who walked out on a life of protection for no reason. I see a contract that needs a signature. What else is there?" Danielle didn't answer with words. She reached for the top button of her coat. Tae-Sung's hand went still on the desk. As she uncurled her fingers and let the heavy fabric fall open, the quiet power of the room shattered like glass. The prominent 8-month curve of her pregnancy was undeniable, a powerful symbol of life in a room dedicated to the mechanics of death. The gold pen slipped from Tae-Sung's fingers, clattering onto the marble floor. His jawline, usually a study in precise control, slackened as he stared at the air he never knew existed. He reached out instinctively, his hand trembling, a fracture in his perfect armor. "Danielle, why?" he whispered, his voice finally human. "Because I saw the tattoo on your neck every morning and knew what it cost to keep you on that throne," she replied, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I refused to let our son be born into your darkness." The silence following Danielle's revelation didn't last. It was punctured not by words, but by the sharp, rhythmic thrum of a high-velocity drone hovering just outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Tae-Sung's eyes, still wide with the shock of the pregnancy, snapped toward the glass a fraction of a second before it disintegrated. A symphony of shattering crystal erupted as specialized breaching charges blew the windows inward. Danielle gasped, her hands instinctively shielding her stomach as a spray of diamonds rained across the mahogany desk. In that heartbeat, the false king vanished, replaced by a predator driven by a singular, primal instinct. Tae-Sung didn't shout. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that bypassed thought. "Get down," his voice roared, no longer a controlled rasp but a command that vibrated in the floorboards. He lunged across the desk, his tailored jacket straining against his shoulders as he swept Danielle into his arms, shielding her body with his own just as the first red laser dots danced across the far wall. The quiet power she had always resented transformed instantly into ruthless protection. He kicked the heavy desk over, creating a temporary barricade against the incoming hail of suppressed gunfire that began to chew through his expensive leather chairs. Tae-Sung, the baby! Danielle's voice was tight with a fear she hadn't felt in months, the weight of her 8th month making every movement a Herculean effort. I have you, he gritted out, pulling a sleek, matte black handgun from beneath the desk's hidden holster. He looked at her, and for the first time, the calculation in his eyes was focused entirely on her survival rather than his profit. I am not losing either of you today. From the shattered window, black-clad figures began to rappel into the office. Tae-Sung didn't hesitate. He fired 3 precise shots, the recoil absorbed by his steady, tattooed hands, clearing a path toward the private elevator. He kept one arm locked firmly around Danielle's waist, taking her weight as they scrambled toward the exit. As the elevator doors hissed shut, Tae-Sung slammed his palm against a hidden panel, activating a manual override that sent the car plummeting toward the basement levels. The digital floor indicator flickered rapidly, reflecting in his dark, narrowed eyes. The divorce papers were gone, likely incinerated or riddled with bullets upstairs, but as Tae-Sung pulled Danielle closer in the dim light of the elevator, it was clear that the transaction of their lives had just become a war. The elevator car jerked to a violent halt, the emergency lights casting a flickering, crimson glow over Tae-Sung's hardened features as the power grid upstairs succumbed to the assault. He stepped forward, his weapon raised to sweep the garage, but Danielle placed a firm hand on his forearm, stopping him before the doors could hiss open. Not the garage, Tae-Sung, she whispered, her voice carrying a quiet authority that cut through the adrenaline-fueled tension. The black sedans waiting out there aren't yours, and your security protocols have already been bypassed. Tae-Sung turned to her, his brow furrowing in confusion. There are no other exits from the sub-basement. This is a fortress. It's a cage, Danielle countered, reaching past him to the maintenance panel. You built this place to keep the world out, but I'm the one who managed the contractors who actually laid the stone. She pressed a specific sequence of floor buttons, 2, 4, and 1, holding them until a low, mechanical groan echoed through the shaft. The back wall of the elevator didn't open. Instead, the floor shifted, dropping another 6 feet into a narrow, concrete corridor thick with the smell of damp earth and stale air. This was the Secretary's map, a network of utility and service tunnels Danielle had quietly supervised during his expansion years, passageways that appeared on no official blueprint. You didn't know about this, she asked, stepping carefully into the tunnel, her hand supporting the weight of her belly. Tae-Sung followed, his eyes scanning the pitch-black hallway with a mix of wary suspicion and growing realization. I was told this was solid bedrock. You were told what you wanted to hear because you stopped looking at the details, Danielle said, navigating the dark with a familiarity that proved she knew his empire better than he ever did. These pipes lead directly to the old Seoul subway expansion. It's the only way out that Tae-Hee's men haven't mapped. Tae-Sung moved behind her, his large frame nearly brushing the low ceiling. He watched the way she moved, slow, deliberate, and entirely in control despite the chaos. For years, he had viewed her as the perfect assistant, a woman who smoothed the edges of his life. He hadn't realized that while he was playing king on the top floor, she had been masterminding the very foundations of his survival. The tunnel slanted downward, the air growing colder as they moved further from the burning penthouse. Danielle stopped at a rusted iron gate, pulling a heavy master key from a hidden notch in the brickwork, a key she had kept for 7 months, just in case. Once we pass this, we're off the grid, she warned, looking back at him. You won't have your guards, your cars, or your cameras. Are you ready to be a ghost, Tae-Sung? He looked at her, then at the life she carried, and for the first time, the quiet power in his eyes was replaced by a profound, humbled respect. He nodded once. Lead the way. The damp, heavy air of the tunnels finally gave way to a sterile, white-tiled sanctuary hidden behind a reinforced steel door. This was the underground clinic, a discreet medical bay Danielle had established during her tenure for off-the-books, employee emergencies, and it was the only place safe enough for them to stop. As the door hissed shut, the adrenaline that had fueled Danielle's flight through the subterranean dark ebbed away, replaced by a sharp, breathless tightening in her abdomen. She leaned heavily against a metal gurney, her face turning a ghostly shade of gray. "Tae-Sung, something is wrong," she gasped, her hand clutching the peak of her belly. The Mafia boss was instantly at her side, his weapon holstered but his movements jagged with a panic he couldn't suppress. The man who had faced down an army in the penthouse now looked completely lost in a room meant for healing. "What do I do? Tell me what to do, Danielle," he pleaded, his voice stripped of all its icy command. "The monitor, the gel I need to check the baby's heart rate," she managed, pointing toward a portable ultrasound unit in the corner. In a profound role reversal, Tae-Sung became the assistant. He moved with frantic humility, fetching supplies and adjusting the lights as Danielle dictated. His large, tattooed hands more accustomed to bruising and cold steel, trembled as he applied the cool gel to her skin under her soft white top. He knelt on the cold floor beside the gurney, his tailored suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink of his past life as he focused intently on the screen. For several agonizing seconds, there was only the sound of static. Tae-Sung's eyes were fixed on Danielle's face, his expression one of raw, prayerful desperation. Then, a rhythmic thud-thud, thud-thud filled the small room. The tension in Tae-Sung's shoulders snapped. He let out a ragged breath, his forehead dropping to rest against the edge of the gurney. "He's there," he whispered, a single tear tracking through the soot on his cheek. "He's still there." Danielle reached down, her fingers brushing the hair at the nape of his neck, finding the man she had loved beneath the false king she had fled. In this sterile, hidden bunker, the power dynamic had completely collapsed. Tae-Sung wasn't a boss or a predator. He was a man terrified of losing the only family he had ever truly wanted. The quiet power was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that proved, for the first time, that he might finally be ready to leave the darkness behind. The heartbeat on the monitor remained a steady, rhythmic promise, but the peace was short-lived as a sharp, electronic chirp cut through the silence of the hidden clinic. Tae-Sung's eyes snapped to his discarded suit jacket, where a burner phone, encrypted with the highest level of syndicate security, glowed with a relentless notification. He reached for it, his hands still slick with the ultrasound gel, and as the screen flickered to life, his face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "It's a proximity alert," he muttered, his voice dropping back into that dangerous, low rasp. He turned the screen toward Danielle, showing a digital map of the city's utility veins. A cluster of red dots was converging on their exact coordinates with surgical precision. Danielle leaned forward, her eyes scanning the data she had once helped organize. "That's impossible. This location was scrubbed from the main servers months ago. No one should be able to ping this hub." "It isn't a server ping," Tae-Sung realized, his grip tightening until the phone's casing groaned. He tapped a submenu, revealing the source code of the tracking signal. It was signed with a private digital key, a key that belonged to his younger brother, Tae-Hee. "He's using the Aegis protocol, the proprietary tracking tech I commissioned to protect my inner circle. He's turned my own shadows against me." The realization hit like a physical blow. Every luxury, every security measure, and every quiet power Tae-Sung had spent a decade building was now being used as a weapon to hunt the woman he loved and the son he had just discovered. His empire wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a gold-plated cage designed to trap him. "Tae-Hee doesn't just want the seat, Danielle," Tae-Sung said, looking at the door as the faint, metallic sound of boots echoed in the distance. "He wants to prove that everything I created is actually his playground. He's been waiting for me to have something to lose." Danielle stood up, her hand finding Tae-Sung's shoulder, grounding him as the walls of his world closed in. "Then we stop playing by his rules," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the rising tide of his ruthless protection. "If he's using your tech, he's expecting you to act like a boss. He isn't expecting you to act like a father." Tae-Sung looked at her, then down at the monitor where their son's heart continued to beat. The false king finally understood. To save his family, he would have to burn the very throne that had betrayed them. He grabbed his weapon, but this time he didn't lead with his ego. He moved with the desperate, focused energy of a man who finally knew what was worth keeping. The heavy thud of tactical boots grew louder in the corridor, vibrating through the tiled floor of the clinic, but Danielle didn't flinch. She sat before the terminal, her fingers hovering over the keys with a grace that belonged to the woman who had once balanced the syndicate's books and Tae-Sung's life with effortless precision. Tae-Sung stood behind her, his ruthless protection manifesting as a living shield, his weapon aimed at the reinforced door while he watched her reflection in the darkened monitors. If Tae-Hee is using your Aegis protocol, he's relying on the high-level encryption keys I generated 3 years ago, Danielle said, her voice a calm, steady anchor amidst the rising panic of the hunt. He thinks he's the king because he has the crown, but he forgot who holds the vault keys. She entered a sequence of legacy admin codes, strings of numbers and symbols she had memorized long before their separation. On the screen, the complex architecture of the Park Syndicate began to unravel, revealing the hidden financial veins that Tae-Hee was using to fund his coup. Tae-Sung watched, stunned, as Danielle bypassed 3 layers of biometric security that even he couldn't touch. "I'm not just locking him out, Tae-Sung," she whispered, a fierce glint in her eyes that mirrored her silent strength. "I'm cutting off the oxygen." With a final, decisive keystroke, she executed a massive, multi-tiered transfer. One by one, the offshore accounts funding the hitmen's burner phones, their transit, and their bounties flickered from green to a dead, hollow gray. In the underworld, loyalty was a transaction, and Danielle had just canceled the check. Outside the door, the sound of shouting erupted, followed by the frantic beeping of deactivated equipment. The digital heist was silent but catastrophic. The mercenaries, suddenly realizing their paydays had vanished into the ether, began to retreat, their professional commitment evaporating along with their bank balances. Tae-Sung lowered his weapon slightly, his gaze shifting from the door to the woman who had just dismantled a small army from a laptop. He had always known she was intelligent, but he had never understood the scale of her power. She wasn't just his secretary or the mother of his child. She was the only person who truly understood how to break his empire to save his soul. "They're leaving," Tae-Sung said, the shock in his voice making him sound more human than ever before. "They were never loyal to him, Tae-Sung," Danielle said, closing the laptop and looking up at him with a weary, resolute smile. "They were loyal to the money, and now Tae-Hee is just a man in a room screaming at a ghost." The reprieve won by Danielle's digital strike was a fragile one, and by the time they reached the private shipping yard at the edge of the Han River, the air was thick with the scent of brine and impending finality. The underrated queen leaned against a rusted shipping container, her breath hitching as the physical toll of the night began to catch up with her. Tae-Sung stood before her, his ruthless protection now a frantic, scanning energy as his eyes searched the towering cranes and stacked steel for the one thing money couldn't fire. A vengeful brother with nothing left to lose. A sudden, sharp metallic ping echoed off the container just inches from Danielle's head, followed by the distant crack of a high-caliber rifle. "Tae-Hee," Tae-Sung hissed, his jaw tightening with quiet power as he shoved Danielle into the narrow gap between 2 crates. A red laser dot danced across the asphalt, searching for a lethal opening. From the darkness of a warehouse balcony, his brother's voice amplified over the yard's PA system, raw and distorted. "You think you can just walk away, brother? You think this child is worth the empire we bled for?" Tae-Sung looked at Danielle, at her silent strength and the life she carried, and then at the massive cargo ships behind him, filled with the gray area wealth that defined his legacy. He realized then that as long as the empire existed, the target would remain on her back. "You want the empire, Tae-Hee, then watch it burn," Tae-Sung roared. With a hand that didn't tremble, he pulled a flare gun from an emergency station and fired it directly into the open hold of his flagship vessel, where the physical ledgers and untraceable assets were stored for transit. The explosion was a beautiful, catastrophic bloom of orange and gold against the night sky. The shockwave forced the sniper to stumble, the laser dot vanishing as the lion's heir was momentarily forgotten in the face of such absolute destruction. Tae-Sung didn't watch the fire. He kept his back to the burning millions, his focus entirely on Danielle. He reached into the gap, his large, tattooed hands pulling her close, shielding her from the heat of his dying empire. "It's gone," he whispered into her hair, the false king finally abdicating his throne. "The money, the ships, the records, it's all ash. He has nothing left to hunt us for." Danielle looked into his shaken, human eyes and saw the finality of his choice. He hadn't just saved her life, he had incinerated the cage he had built around them both. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Tae-Sung picked her up, his ruthless protection now a tender, desperate promise as they moved toward the only thing that mattered. The adrenaline that had sustained Danielle through the inferno at the docks finally broke, replaced by a seismic wave of pain that doubled her over in the cramped backseat of the getaway car. The quiet power of the night had vanished, replaced by the frantic, mechanical roar of the engine, as Tae-Sung pushed the vehicle through the rain-slicked streets of the city's edge. Danielle's breath came in ragged, shallow hitches, her fingers digging into the upholstery, as her body signaled a finality that no amount of Mafia logic could delay. "Tae-Sung, it's time," she gasped, her voice thick with the silent strength that had defined her entire journey. "The adrenaline, it's over. He's coming now." Tae-Sung's eyes, usually so calculating and cold, darted to the rearview mirror, reflecting a raw, human desperation. He swerved into a dark, secluded alleyway beneath a rusted overpass, the car skidding to a halt amidst the shadows. He didn't wait for the engine to die before he was in the back seat, his ruthless protection now channeled into a desperate, grounding tenderness. As the sirens of his dying empire wailed in the distant city center, Tae-Sung reached out to take Danielle's hand. But before he did, he paused. He looked down at his own fingers, where the heavy, golden onyx rings of the Park Syndicate sat like anchors of his past life, symbols of the false king who viewed everything as a transaction. With a sharp, decisive motion, he pulled the rings from his hands and tossed them into the footwell of the car, letting them clatter into the darkness. For the first time in a decade, his hands were bare, the dark tattoos on his knuckles the only remaining scars of the man he used to be. He entwined his fingers with Danielle's, his grip a steady, warm anchor against the storm of her labor. "I'm here," he whispered, his forehead leaning against hers, his voice stripped of all command and replaced by a prayerful resolve. "I'm right here, Danielle, just us. No empire, no shadows, just us." The birth under fire was not a scene of cinematic glory, but a gritty, beautiful battle for life in the dim light of a dashboard. Danielle screamed, her underrated queen resilience pushing through the agony, while Tae-Sung held her with a focus that far surpassed any boardroom strategy. When the first cry of their son, Leo, finally pierced the muffled quiet of the alley, Tae-Sung didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had finally found the only throne worth holding, a seat at the side of the woman who had saved him from himself. The sharp, metallic tang of the city and the heavy scent of gunpowder had long since faded, replaced by the warm, domestic aroma of brewing coffee and sun-warmed cedar. A year had passed since the night the empire burned, and in the quiet of a high-ceilinged suburban home, the silence was no longer a weapon, but a sanctuary. Park Tae-Sung stood in the center of the kitchen, his tall, sharply built frame draped not in a tailored black suit, but in a soft linen shirt with the sleeves pushed back to reveal the dark ink of his past. He wasn't calculating a hostile takeover or analyzing a security breach. Instead, his piercing eyes were focused with quiet power on the task of carefully cutting fruit into bite-sized pieces for the toddler seated in the high chair before him. Leo, possessing his father's precise jawline and his mother's radiant spirit, reached out with a joyful shout, his small fingers grasping at Tae-Sung's bare, ringless hand. The man who once decided the fate of the underworld, with a whisper now, found his world rearranged by a one-year-old's laughter. The front door opened, and the rhythmic click of heels signaled the arrival of the underrated queen. Danielle entered the room, looking elegant and grounded, carrying the briefcase of the CEO of Brookspark Logistics, the legitimate conglomerate they had built from the ashes of the old syndicate. She paused, a soft, steady smile blooming as she watched the legitimate king navigate the complexities of a mid-afternoon snack. "The quarterly reports are finalized," she said, leaning against the counter as Tae-Sung handed her a cup of coffee exactly the way she liked it. "The board is pushing for the Busan expansion, but I told them we're prioritizing the community wellness initiative first." Tae-Sung moved toward her, his aura no longer that of a predator, but of a partner who had finally found his equal. He placed a hand on her waist, a gesture of ownership and protection that was no longer rooted in control, but in a profound, humbled respect. "Whatever you decide, Danielle," he murmured, his voice a low, human rasp that carried no shadows. "I'm just the stay-at-home support today. Leo and I have a very busy schedule involving the park and a nap." They stood together in the light of the setting sun, a contrast of soft resolve and reformed strength. The false king had been replaced by a man who understood that true power wasn't found in a throne, but in the transparency of a life shared without secrets. As Danielle leaned her head against his shoulder, they weren't a boss and a secretary, or a mafia legend and a runaway bride. They were a family, finally at peace in a kingdom built on nothing but the truth. Here comes the end of the story. If the story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel.